because I believe science might offer an answer to the curse of the Bambino.
Why someone took so long to hire that guy is beyond me. Anybody who's not tearing their team down right now and rebuilding it using your model, they're dinosaurs. One of the great things about money is it buys a lot of things. One of which is the luxury to disregard what baseball likes, doesn't like, what baseball thinks, doesn't think. This is threatening, not just a way of doing business, but in their minds, it's threatening the game.
How can you not be romantic about baseball?
All right, welcome to another Baseball Opps podcast. This is going to be a really special show for me because we have a legend here. Sometimes calling people legends can not sound right, but really well-respected doctor in the field, runs the research and development at ASMI, American Sports Medicine Institute, Dr. Glenn Fleisig. Did I introduce you well, Doctor?
That was perfect. Yeah, very flattering, and I'm happy to be here.
Same here. I've read all your work. I'm hoping in the beginning of this, you can help me kind of introduce all the great work you've done, specifically in the field of biomechanics or more into the medical side of your work. Why don't we just get started with that? Let's just introduce everyone to you. You kind of start from how you got into biomechanics. I think a lot of people that are going to be listening are going to also be interested how you got into this field and with ASMI. Can you kind of give us a crash course?
Yeah, sure. Way back in the Stone Age, I went to MIT up in Boston, and I was majoring in mechanical engineering. This was in the early 1980s. And I liked mechanical engineering, but honestly, I like sports, baseball in particular. And but I figured I wasn't good enough to be a pro baseball player, wasn't going to be a sports medicine doctor. I figured I'd just play baseball or softball with my friends, watch baseball on TV, and have a day job doing mechanical engineering. Well, back in the 1980s, I wandered into a lab at MIT called a biomechanics lab. Again, I'd never heard this word biomechanics before, and it was kind of a new field. And in the biomechanics lab, they had people doing gait, which is like walking and things like that, and then they were studying a golf swing. And I thought, wait a second, you could put mechanical engineering into studying sports. And so I got involved in that there. And after that, I asked the professor there, where are jobs in biomechanics, sports biomechanics? And he laughed. I remember him laughing, even though it was 35 years ago. And he said, there are no jobs in sports biomechanics. And but he knew someone at the United States Olympic Training Center in Colorado Springs. And so I did an internship there. So internships are always a good idea for advancing your career. And I went out there, and from there, I met the research director there named Dr. Chuck Dillman, who was really a father of the field of biomechanics. And I told him I liked baseball and I was doing well in my internship. And he said there was an up-and-coming young doctor named Dr. Jim Andrews. He's a Southerner. He lives in Georgia at the time. And so he introduced me, and I spoke to Dr. Andrews 1984, and we hit it off. But he wasn't ready to start his own place, Dr. Andrews, at that point. He was still at another center. But a couple years later, 1987, Dr. Andrews called me and said he's ready. And I was ready, and I dropped what I was doing, and I moved to Birmingham, Alabama, which I probably didn't even know where it was on the map at that point. But opportunity knocked, and the rest is history. Dr. Andrews and I and others have formed American Sports Medicine Institute in 1987. In fact, Dr. Andrews formed two companies, his medical practice and ASMI, and both are doing well, and he's still doing well. The medical practice is, as you would think, they treat surgeries, do surgeries and other types of treatment. But ASMI is a nonprofit research and education institute, and we set it up to understand and prevent injuries in sports. A big thing we do, Brent, is biomechanics. And what biomechanics, as I was saying, my background, is studying human motion using cameras and understanding the body, but also understanding the laws of physics. So that's a little brief.
That was perfect. And that's what your PhD is in? Is it in specifically in biomechanics?
So I actually came to ASMI again after my Olympic experience. I had a bachelor's degree from MIT, and I was in after the Olympics. I went to go get a master's degree in biomedical engineering. I was really kind of into this at Washington University in St. Louis. But then out of the blue, Dr. Andrews called me 2 or 3 years later. This is before internet and all that stuff. So
Right.
I guess he kept my phone number on a piece of paper or something. And 2 or 3 years later, he called me and said, "Are we ready?" And I'm like, "I'm ready." And I essentially walked away from my master's program at Wash U, and I came over here to Birmingham, and kept in contact with the Wash U people, and I was almost done. I finished that remotely, and then I got my PhD here in Birmingham at UAB in biomedical engineering, biomechanics specialty. So essentially, sometimes I guess the lesson learned is when opportunity knocks and you're confident in yourself and you do a good job, you go for it, and sometimes things work out well.
And you run into an icon like Dr. Andrews, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, he wasn't an icon.
At the time.
He was an icon to be.
Right. He was.
Yeah,
Man,
yeah.
I got to run into him at the Injuries in Baseball course a couple years ago that you guys do, and it was awesome. And where does he get all his fire from? I mean, that guy, he's impressive.
Oh, definitely. I've been fortunate to work with a couple of real leaders, Dr. Chuck Dillman, who I said in biomechanics, and Dr. James Andrews. From the beginning, again, I was in my 20s and he was in his 40s, but he has such a respect for all his co-workers, including me, and he's such a team player and such a imaginative thinker. I mean, he's a great surgeon because of how he views the problem, whether it's the surgery or the big picture of the person. And the other thing he's always done is his effort is, the expression 110%. I mean, that's him. So, doctors cover sidelines and things like that, cover games and work with the trainers and all that stuff. And he's in his 70s, Dr. Andrews, and he still outworks everyone else around him. And again, it was amazing to watch him when he was in his 40s and 50s starting out here. He would have essentially about 4 fellows, which are young doctors in training, who were helping him with 4 different surgery cases at a time, and he would go from one to another and essentially be doing 4 surgeries at the same time. Then when the day was over, he'd talk to the trainer from some professional baseball or football team, and then on Friday go fly to a Washington Redskins game or on Saturday an Alabama football game. He just it's unbelievable.
He is. He's otherworldly. I don't think he's from this world.
Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. And I think you really are one of the pioneers of biomechanics. Like you said, when you came in, it wasn't really a popular thing. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, I don't even know. Is there a PhD in biomechanics now? Because like you said, you got yours
in biomedical engineering.
Right.
I got mine. Yeah. So biomechanics is an interesting field because it's kind of biology and mechanics. So there are different ways to get there. You could take more of an engineering approach, which is what I did, or you could take a more of an exercise science approach. So different schools have different types of programs, whether it's called biomechanics or biomedical engineering or kinesiology or exercise science. So there are different ways to get there, and then people have different strengths, whether it's more the engineering and math or more the human body understanding. If you really want to be an expert of it, you need to understand both.
I think great point. I'm getting my master's in kinesiology right now, and I want to go even more in depth into biomechanics. It's really what I'm passionate about. That's why I've been led to you. I've read every study I could find, and you're on a lot of them. But I think I have more of the kinesiology, the body perspective of biomechanics. But you're right. Like there's a very mathematical engineering side of it as well. And would you say, is that where your perspective comes from, or would you say both?
Yeah, no one's perfect, but so you're probably stronger at one than the other, and I'm probably the opposite of you.
Right.
I'm stronger in the engineering and the math and the science, and then I learned as much about the human body biology as I could to complement that, whereas you're probably coming from the other side. And our ASMI team, we try to have both types because honestly, our best biomechanics comes with our brilliant minds we have here working on the science and the engineering, but also working with some of the top doctors like Dr. Andrews and Dr. Dugas and Kane, and physical therapists like Kevin Wilk, and also some of the coaches. Essentially, Brent, when we see a baseball player and we see he's getting hurt, he's hurting his elbow, I might see, well, look at the physics. Look at that, how he's passing the energy up. And the doctor might say, well, I can just imagine the ulnar collateral ligament and the strain on that. And the pitching coach is, well, look, he's stepping across his foot. So these are all different words or different viewpoints, but looking at the same person. And really, the success of sports biomechanics is the ability to put together the different perspectives on the person.
Now I'm just really fascinated by what we can do here. Because I think I'm going to be coming to you from the body with a lot of my questions, and I'm really intrigued to get this other perspective, which I know it's so valuable. Physics and the math of all this is incredibly valuable. Like, I mean, not trying to get too complicated, but like inverse kinetics, like really almost being able to define energy flow through the body, I think is like the ultimate perspective of really truly understanding how biomechanics work. Would that be would that be correct, or what would you say?
Exactly. So my objective of the rest of this podcast is for you to ask very practical questions, and for me to give answers with mathematical equations that are too complicated to understand.
That would be awesome.
But seriously, what you're saying is correct. There's what's called dynamics, and then there's inverse dynamics or inverse kinetics.
Yeah.
And dynamics means you move your body this way, and you apply force. And this is how you move your body from that. Of course, that's how we move. We apply a force on our joints and we move. Inverse dynamics or inverse kinetics, for your listeners or viewers, is the opposite. You observe the motion and then you go back and calculate what kind of forces must have been created to make that motion.
Right, because a slight change in, hip position or elbow position will change the pattern of forces all the way around the body, correct?
Correct. And again, if we studied biomechanics and baseball players by sticking little force sensors inside their elbow and shoulder and joints, then we would have forward dynamics, meaning we'd be measuring the forces directly. But we do inverse dynamics, which means we have cameras. We don't stick forces in their joints. We have cameras. This is how biomechanics works typically. And you see, here's how they moved. And you say, well, to move the arm there, you must apply so much force at your elbow or shoulder.
Well, let's really attack the pitching delivery. Most of my audience is pitching here, so let's go right at it. I just like to start where I feel the conventional wisdom wants to go, and then I try to reset the collective perspective from that position. So, conventionally, over the years we've gravitated to the arm first. Do you find that to be a problem if you're truly going to understand the biomechanics of, say, a pitching delivery? Is if you gravitate right to the arm first?
I need you to clarify a little. What do you mean the arm first?
I guess when you're going right to how the arm action, the arm speeds, the arm torques, like to really define the pitching delivery, is it a mistake to start first understanding the arm before understanding any other aspect or any other part of the body?
Okay, I got you. Yes, it is. And I know it's a leading question because you know so also. I wish I could say that the key to successful pitching, I want to define successful pitching as good performance, but also safe and not getting hurt, okay? But it would be it would be great if good pitching biomechanics could be summed up in one thing, bend your elbow like this or move your shoulder. But unfortunately, the body's much more complicated than that. And it's a coordinated sequence of motions. So the key is not the elbow. The key is not the shoulder. The key is not the hip or the knee. Unfortunately, the key is all those pieces. The kinetic chain, it's all those pieces put together. And to say the key is just this one piece is not going to work. You have to look at all the pieces together.
And you know what? I think you caught me right in the beginning. I'm glad you did. I'm going to apologize. A lot of my questions are going to be leading questions.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. It sounds good.
And I think that's why I'm happy to have you here, because of course I have a perspective. I did this. I
Right.
played professionally and tore my rotator cuff and rebuilt it and then studied my butt off. And obviously I do have a perspective and my opinion and my kind of method. And I love challenging it. And ultimately that's why I'm excited, because I think you're going to really help challenge it and help me, see it completely and try not to be like pigeonholed in anything. So going forward, obviously that's probably where I'm going to be coming from, but I'm enjoying this. So when we say kinetic chain, I'm a big believer in kinetic chain, but you still kind of hear that like this is a theory, like there might be another way to look at biomechanics. Is there another way to look at biomechanics outside of the kinetic chain?
Well, no. There could be. The kinetic chain is definitely real. Coordination is definitely real. But I cannot say there's only one proper way to pitch. Okay, just like people who were doing high jumps back in the 1960s said the way to do it is jump belly down. And then this guy, Dick Fosbury, came along and did a Fosbury flop and did back down. So there wasn't just one way. This guy found a better way. And likewise, more recently, in downhill skiing, for instance, ski jump, it used to be you did the jump and you pull the tips of your skis up parallel towards your nose, but now they do it with a V shape. And so someone figured out a better way. So is there a better way of pitching than what I'm going to describe? There might be, but I don't know if there is. I doubt it. I could tell you when I'm going to explain to you what the kinetic chain is. I'm not just making it up. Like we said, I've done this for 30 years, and I've been fortunate enough to test thousands and thousands of baseball pitchers in our biomechanics lab with little markers on them and quantifying their motion from, I think, about 10 Cy Young Award winners and hundreds and hundreds of pro pitchers. So what I can tell you is I could tell you how the best pitchers pitch. I can't tell you if there's in my imagination, a better way, but I doubt it. And I could say the proper way to pitch based on the best pitchers who have ever pitched is a certain way. That being said, Brent, if you want, I'd like to describe a little bit what the proper mechanics are.
Please do.
Okay.
I mean, I'm looking at this as being educational for everyone listening.
Sure. So top to bottom, we actually look at the mechanics in the order things happen. So we don't jump right to the arm. We start with the legs. And so whether it's a windup or a stretch position, we study when the front knee, let's just assume in this discussion that the pitcher is right-handed. And so when he brings his left knee up to the maximum knee height point he's going to do, we look to see if he's balanced and consistent pitch to pitch. And then a very key moment for us is the instant that the front foot, the left foot in this case, touches the mound and lands. We call this the instant of foot contact. And honestly, people are not getting hurt at the instant of foot contact, but everyone has a front foot contact. So it's an excellent checkpoint just to see if things are timed. And so at the time of front foot contact, whether it's your heel or your toe or flat foot, when your front foot first hits the mound and starts to put the weight back on the mound, we do a checkpoint to see if your hips have started to rotate, so your belly button is starting to face home plate, but keeping your shoulders closed so that your two shoulders are essentially, and your front hand are essentially in line with the target, if that makes sense. At the same time, we look at the throwing hand, the right hand in this case, and see if it's rotated up and if it's in sync with the body and not ahead of the game or behind the game. And so some of the measurements we look at, Brent, at the time of front foot contact is that the back arm should be abducted, meaning the right shoulder armpit angle should be about 90 degrees, meaning your right elbow should be about the height of an imaginary line through your two shoulders. And just as importantly, the hand, the right hand holding the ball, should have externally rotated up. In other words, if your front foot, your left foot lands, but your hand is still lower than your elbow, and your right hand is lower than your right elbow, then you're late. If, on the other hand, your right forearm is vertical before your foot lands, then your arm is early. Your arm is out of sync again, but too early compared to the body. So again, at the time of front foot contact, a good visual checkpoint is a right-handed pitcher should be essentially showing the ball to the shortstop, or if we still have a conventional shortstop position, and likewise a lefty, if you're playing traditional defense, he would be showing the baseball to the second baseman, not to second base, but to the second baseman. That's an important checkpoint. Again, people don't really get hurt there, but things go out of whack if they're not good at that point. From that point, in super high-speed video, we see a sequence of motions where the pitcher catches his weight on that front foot, and the left knee would bend a little, but then it catches and stops bending and starts to straighten it out. That's why it's important to have strong legs. And at the same time, the pelvis, the hips continue to rotate so the belly button is facing the batter, and then the upper trunk rotates, a little delay there, so you're using your trunk. And while the trunk's going forward, the arm continues to go backwards. So you get this, you've seen these photographs of these pitchers in this arm cocked position where their trunk, their chest is facing home plate, but their arm is cocked back so far that essentially the palm is up to the sky, facing the sky. And that's what we call the maximum external rotation of the shoulder. And we take a lot of measurements at that point to make sure that the arm has rotated back enough as elite pitchers, that the elbow is bent the right amount. And then from that moment, you straighten your elbow, in other words, elbow extension. You flip your shoulder forward. That's called shoulder internal rotation velocity. And you let go of the ball. And you know what, Brent? No one's mechanics after they let go of the ball is going to affect the pitch,
right,
but it's going to affect their ability to pitch again.
Right,
so you need good mechanics, yes, as you're saying, to decelerate. So after releasing the ball, just like we had a whole kinetic chain from the leg up to the arm to build up energy, you need a proper kinetic chain from the arm back down to the legs to dissipate the energy. And you have the essentially a reverse sequence where the arm has to continue its motion, then the upper trunk and the hips, everything gets into it and it has a follow through.
Perfect. So a lot of that would be defined as kinematics as opposed to kinetics. Is that correct?
That's correct. Kinematics is the word for motions, and kinetics is the word to describe how you made those motions, like the forces and torques that created those motions.
So can we define kinetics in a similar sequence? Is it proper to say we can start with ground force and then there's multiplying forces through, say, the stretch shortening cycle to the body, or is there a certain way to define the kinetics in a similar sequence?
It's an interesting question. We've had debates and discussions about this in the biomechanics community, and one of our favorite terms in biomechanics is the kinetic chain. But a recent conversation by the International Society of Biomechanics on our chat line is people have different definitions of it, okay?
Right.
So everyone says kinetic chain is important, and then some people, obviously on these online chats, everyone kind of gets off on a tangent, but some people say it's kinetic chain, and some people say maybe we should call it a kinematic chain,
right?
Because you're really talking about the sequence of the kinematics or the motions. And then someone else says, no, it should be kinetic chain. And then someone says whether it's throwing a baseball or swinging a golf club, is a proper mechanics, is it you do this motion, then this motion, then this motion, or you do this force, this force, this force, or you pass up do this energy, this energy, this energy. So our approach at ASMI has been the sequence of the mechanics, and specifically the sequence of the velocities of the different body parts, and that's how we've done it. I actually like that approach because it's what you see. Mm-hmm. You can see how you moved your body. But other people, I think it's equally valid, talk about the kinetic chain as a sequence of energy transfers or a sequence of forces and torques, but that's not been the approach we've done.
Do you have an opinion on the effects of ground force on the pitching delivery? Sure.
There's some research on that as well, and it's a long debate. Precedes me about whether a pitcher pushes off the rubber or falls, has a controlled fall from the rubber to the front foot. There have been some a limited number of studies that have quantified or measured the force pushing off the rubber and the force landing, and it has been kind of inconclusive to me in my observation, or it seems that you could do it a couple of different ways, but I honestly think it's like a hybrid. You don't just have a fall, you do have a push, but it's not most pitchers don't do a crazy push. It's kind of a controlled fall from gravity of your front side of your leg, front side of your body tipping forward, but you do push to some extent off the back foot.
Yeah, they're one of my favorite studies. I use it all the time. It just when I heard this, it just really made sense to me, and to find to me the kinetic sequencing and the importance of it. I'm sure you've heard it. You might have been in the study. I don't know. The Kibler and Chandler. Have you worked with them?
Sure. I know Ben Kibler. He's excellent, and
yeah.
Jeff Chandler. Yeah.
Well, they calculated in this. I'm going to read it from their study. Calculated that a 20% decrease in kinetic energy delivered from the hip and trunk to the arm requires a 34% increase in the rotational velocity of the shoulder to impart the same amount of force to the hand. Do you believe? How do you perceive that?
I totally believe that. There are two things happening here. One is just listening to you quote that. One is that yes, if you're missing energy from one part of the chain, then up the chain you have to overdo it, and overcompensate, and that's honestly the key factor we're trying to prevent. Two pitchers could pitch 90 miles per hour, but one guy could be doing it just with his arm, and the other person's transferring the energy up. And like you just said in that study, if the lower parts or the initial parts don't do their part, then the other parts have to do more. The other thing of interest is not only are you passing up energy and building upon it, but the body parts are getting smaller. So the amount of energy, let's say the angular velocity of the hip rotation, pelvis rotation, and upper trunk rotation are much less than the angular velocities at the shoulder and elbow, because you're passing up energy, but you have large body parts passing up energy, which is more mass and less velocity. But then once you get to the arm, you have smaller body parts, you have less mass, and then it will translate that energy into more velocity. So it works out nicely that that the velocities get bigger because the parts are getting smaller.
Yeah, and to me that really paints the picture, I believe, to efficiencies and being able to really, because I'm in a position where I'm trying to help kids increase performance, but because I was a rotator cuff victim, I don't want to ever push them into injuries. So this is where I've gravitated to, was kinetic energy and trying to get the lower extremities to contribute more, because to me it's almost worth twice of what I'm going to create in the upper extremities. And just a lot of the studies show the more we delay the trunk, the more forward trunk we get, we can actually and bring more energy to the ball, and it can reduce stress on the arm in the process. Do you believe that's possible in the kinetic chain, that we can actually increase velocity on the ball and reduce stress, or not exaggerate stress in the arm? Do you think that's possible?
Yeah, definitely. I see it all the time here. But I also want to say there are limits to this. So I think if you do it properly and have the proper motions of your hips and your trunk and your legs before that, and pass up the energy properly to your arms and to your arm, you can avoid the situation where you're demanding too much of your arm. That being said, you can't always take it to the next step. You can't always say, well, what if my hips go twice the speed or twice as early? It doesn't work that way. And so most of the variables we see, that whether it's shoulder external rotation angle or timing of the upper trunk rotation, there's a proper range, and doing too little is bad, but also doing too much is bad or doesn't help.
Right. Well, it's like the whip analogy. Like there has to be sequencing, the sequencing, the timing, or it's called the speed phenomenon. Like the previous segment, well, the next segment can't start until the previous segment has peaked to
Correct.
properly accelerate energy, right?
Right. Can't. Right. Could just start a little bit, but that's the kinetic chain principle as I believe it and understand it exactly. And so a couple of analogies are this. If you look at the human body, the picture, and I am fortunate to watch it in super slow motion, and I could see these different things, and you can actually see the different parts of the body taking their turns and going. Some other things that we could all see is like a whip. We're talking about a whip, but if you have a big bull whip or something like that, you can see the handle moves a certain speed, and then, if you watch it in slow motion, the handle moves a certain speed, and then the middle part of the whip goes back and whips forward, and then the upper part. And not only that, but the whip is getting smaller and lighter, thinner as you go towards the tip. And like I'm saying, the body parts are getting smaller. That's one analogy I like to use. Another analogy I like to use is let's say ice skating or roller blading, where let's say a bunch of 7 friends are skating around the rink and want to do the whip when the guy running the rink isn't watching or whatever, and they all hold hands and they don't all push at the same time. They all are skating, and then the first kid pushes his energy into his hands of holding the second kid, who gets the energy, and when he feels just right, he passes on and adds his energy into his other arm to the next kid going down the chain. Honestly, that analogy works well also, because if you did it optimally, you have the biggest kid at the beginning, and then you smaller and smaller kids until the last kid who you want to whip is the smallest kid, and that's an optimal kinetic chain.
And great analogy, but tell me if I'm wrong. It's interesting how we always do this. We always find analogies for throwing that are similar, or they're angular, they're rotational movements. And you can, as far as in physics, it almost works the same way, even if there is no rotation. Meaning, there's a great little experiment they've been doing on YouTube recently. You might have seen it, where they're showing how a supernova explodes, and they'll take a really big bouncy ball, and then a smaller bouncy ball, and then like a golf ball, and they'll stack them on top of each other, and they'll drop them simultaneously, and the energy from the big ball pushes through the middle, the smaller ball, and then all the way to the golf ball, and the golf ball goes, explodes like 50 feet in the air. But then if you just drop the golf ball, you maybe goes 10 feet up. So it shows how energy can multiply also without an angular movement. Would that be correct?
Well, you have a lot of interesting concepts there, Brent, and I'd like you to actually send me that video. I'd like to see that supernova thing. But energy can multiply and can build upon it. You have certain limitations in your body because of how physiology, how muscles and ligaments and tendons and how the tissues work. You have fast twitch and slow twitch, and they have certain elasticity and limits. But a place in baseball where what you're saying is really evident is in non-wood bats and metal bats and balls.
Right.
I serve on the USA Baseball bat committee. I serve on the USA Baseball Medical and Safety Committee. Actually, I'm the chairman of it. But we have bat regulations for metal bats and or non-wood bats, as we call them. And if you know, and your listeners, about 15 years ago, college baseball was essentially out of control as far as the scores of the games, and typical games in the World Series or elsewhere would it be like 15-10 and or 20 or 18-12 or whatever, and the bats were a little too souped up.
Right.
Okay, and just talking about elasticity, without manipulating the ball much, you could manipulate a non-wood bat a lot to have like a elasticity and a spring-like motion. What we've done now in USA Baseball and in NCAA college baseball is we made regulations for the performance of the bats that are legal, that they could only be there's a whole testing procedure where you fire these baseballs in an air cannon off the bats, and they could only bounce off a certain amount to be more wood-like.
Right.
But it's just an example that you could actually add on more energy than you would anticipate
Right.
by the combination of materials.
Well, I look at it in the pitching delivery as far as in the kinematics of this energy production. We can do it in two ways. We can create rotational movements like the pelvis rotation, the trunk rotation, but then we have extension movements like leg extension, mainly, I mean, more in the leg extension, some in the arm extension, but I'd say probably more force generated in the leg extension. But the point is that's going to create energy as well. So can we break down the pitching delivery in those two movements, an angular movement and say a linear movement, a push towards the target?
Yeah, definitely. Conventionally, as your listeners, the coaches will know, in baseball, there's often talk about the building up the energy and the pitching motion in the linear direction, and then there's the rotational or angular. And how people usually view this is the linear is if you are, again, a right-handed pitcher, but you're looking at him from the third base view, you're looking at how much things am I seeing? Is he tilting his trunk forward? Is he bending his knee? What do I see from this side view or sagittal view, as we say? And that would be called the linear. And the angular would almost be like the bird's eye view from overhead, how much things are rotating about the spine, and how did that contribute? The truth is, as we know, we want the baseball to have linear velocity, to go straight, but nothing on your body moves like that. There's no spring or anything. There's no linear thing. Your body is just a bunch of joints, angles. Well, even on your hips and your back, there are a bunch of bones and angles. So it's tricky, and it's very impressive. It's beautiful. How do we get the most velocity, linear velocity, from a sequence of angular rotations and motions? So even the ones you're talking about being linear, like the front knee or tilting the trunk, it's an angle, but it's just
still rotating.
In that plane. It's just in that plane,
well,
and your body only moves in angles. But that being said, I do think there are some pitchers who are relying more on this, let's say, linear drive, which is like a longer stride or straightening their front knee or more extension forward. And there are other pitchers who are more rotational from the overhead view. But I do want to point out that all those things are angles. And I do think that the guy who's more rotational, he might be better suited for being more of a sidearm pitcher. And the one who's more or less, as you're calling, linear, that's more the typical characteristics of the over-the-top pitcher. And honestly, most pitchers are three-quarter arm slot, and they're a combination of utilizing both.
Yeah, I mean, I think they're all versions of both. And what I try to do, because in optimizing performance, what would be your opinion on this? I'm trying to help them optimize. And you're right. I'm not talking, because if we're talking anatomically, each joint rotates on the anatomical plane, so sagittal, frontal.
But I'm okay. Now that we clarified, I'm okay with us, you in our conversation. Linear is that.
I guess, but you're right. I'm saying
forward thing, and angular is what it looks like from the.
Exactly. I guess I'm saying linear is in momentum outside of the body. Where's the energy going? And rotational would be, more, I guess, centrifugal force applying the movement. But what I try to do, my perspective in enhancing performance, is I try to help them optimize both. So if I see a kid who's, like you said, very rotational, they're not going to have the long stride, the trunk's not going to want to move forward much, I try to teach them or help them optimize a more linear movement to add to that. Because specifically when I measure them, and they'll have like elite rotational measurements, and they'll have extremely poor, say, linear measurements. Would you say that's a good perspective to try to help these athletes optimize and kind of get a good combination of linear to rotational energy?
Yes, again, based on all the pro pitchers I've seen, the best are using both. And the other problem that I know you're aware of is if a guy is all rotational, he could have trouble with his accuracy, his control.
Right.
He throws inside and outside on batters because he releases too early or too late, and it's not the ideal.
And I think it affects precision or accuracy strictly in the fact of if I have a gun and I'm running at something that I'm shooting, it'd be easier to hit my target as opposed to if I'm running away from it, right? Would that be a good analogy?
I don't shoot people, but yeah.
Well, I'm not shooting. Let's say shoot a tree, right?
Okay, sure.
A target.
Actually, really, your analogy, what I'd say is, I think it's easier to shoot that tree if you're running towards it and just pushing your hand forward and backward than if you're just swinging it left to right. Then that's more like the angular pitcher.
Right.
It'd be hard to hit the tree if you're swinging your arm left to right. Yeah.
But so how about this? How about with injury? Don't you? I believe pitchers that are more predominantly rotational, specifically very obviously aggressive at high intent in rotation, typically have more of the arm injuries. Because typically, like I find, the arm path is angulate. I mean, you get into hyperangulation more if you're extremely rotational than if you're trying to move more linear, more towards the target. What would be your opinion on that?
Yeah, as you said, I don't really think you're one or the other. I think you're just trying to do it all right. We recently wrote a paper. Escamilla, my colleague, was the first author. Escamilla, comparing pro pitchers who were overhand, over the top, three quarters, and sidearm, and there were a lot more similarities than differences among those three groups. We quantified some differences. I don't have it. It's too hard to explain right on this podcast, but there were more similarities than differences. For instance, one similarity is all the pitchers, regardless of if you're sidearm or over the top, you still have to keep your throwing shoulder abducted about 90 degrees.
Right.
So what that tells us is there are different ways to move your trunk and succeed, but there's essentially only one way the shoulder can work, which is with that 90-degree abduction, because essentially that's how the joint is built.
And do you believe? I think I learned hyperangulation from Dr. Job. He credited a lot of the arm injury to that lag, that arm drag, the arm pulling, specifically the elbow behind the scapular plane. Do you believe it's as dangerous as he made it sound?
Yeah. So successful pitchers are on the edge. They are getting the best performance, but they're close to injury, and that's where they sit, and that's where the pro athletes are. And unfortunately, that's why so many are getting hurt, even at high school level, because they're on that edge, and some of them tip over. And so we have found in our science that the best pitchers have more shoulder external rotation, and they also have a good amount of what we call horizontal abduction, which I think is what you're referring to, which is essentially pinching your elbows behind your back. And they have a good amount of that. If you have too much horizontal abduction, pinching your elbow behind your back, you're going to put too much stress and potential tear on the front of your shoulder. Likewise, you want to have a lot of external rotation, where I talked about the palm facing up and rotating the arm back. And more is better for velocity, but too much, you're going to have shoulder injury. One of the injuries we see is what's called internal impingement, which is where the rotator cuff on the back of the shoulder gets pinched in the shoulder joint because you rotated it back so far and essentially squished it in there. So I don't know. The elite pitchers have to have a lot of shoulder rotation in particular, and but if you do some things to try to force it, you're really going down the road of increased chance of injury. Let me give you a couple examples. I just said the more shoulder external rotation you have, the more velocity you'll have. And so then listeners here or elsewhere say, okay, well, whoever this kid is, I'm going to work on him to get more shoulder external rotation. Well, sometimes you have as much as you can have, and you got it. That's it. Accept it. But sometimes a pitcher wasn't really a throwing athlete growing up, and he doesn't have as much external rotation. It turns out it's a developmental thing. And you said, Brent, you played ball. You probably have more. Are you right-handed?
Yes.
You probably have more external rotation on your right shoulder than your left shoulder,
Right.
and you probably have more internal rotation on your left shoulder than the right shoulder.
Right.
And what that means is a throwing athlete has a natural development where they have more ability to rotate their throwing arm back. That being said, if you take a soccer player who's 18 years old and try to force the issue, you're just going to tear things. The bones have grown a certain way in the soft tissue. Another thing we are interested in and concerned about at the same time is weighted baseballs. We've done a couple of studies, both in the biomechanics lab and in the field, and we found out that these weighted baseball programs throwing, a standard baseball is 5 ounces, but throwing 4-ounce, 3-ounce underweight baseballs and heavier baseballs, 6, 7, 1 pound, 2-pound balls, that we found that it does change the mechanics. You don't throw a 1-pound ball with the same mechanics as a 5-ounce ball, but even the smaller differences, we found measurable differences in the mechanics. Not a bad thing, but measurable differences. And we also found in our training study that pitchers who pitch with, high school pitchers in this case, pitch with a weighted ball training program gain ball velocity in a short amount of time. We also found that they gained shoulder external rotation, not during pitching, but in a physical exam. They gained shoulder external rotation in this 6-week training program. And we also found they had an increased risk of injury. So what I'm saying is there are some things you could do. There's a proper training, whether it's weighted baseballs or just good mechanics or strength and conditioning, that optimize an athlete. But if you overdo it, push the body past its natural point, you'll have good velocity for like a day,
Right.
and then you'll be hurt.
Well, I'm glad you bring up the weighted balls. My issue, I've never been a fan of it. I used it when I was young, and it was ironic. I wound up getting seriously hurt. That was before I tore my rotator cuff, but I was doing that and a lot of extreme throwing. My thing on it is, if I'm as a coach or as a biomechanics analyst or using a kinetic chain approach to train an athlete, timing is a big part of the equation. And when you use a weighted object outside of the weight that they're going to be, accustomed to or having to throw every day, you're trying to get the effects of loading. Overload, underload is an effective approach. Like you said, you do gain velocity. Not everyone, but a lot. But if you're trying to use the effects of loading and it's going to, on the bad side or the negative side, negatively affect timing, then is that really a good training modality?
Yeah, so I want to loop in, besides weighted baseball throwing, I want to loop in long toss as well. And these are two common throwing training programs. And I think they both have a value, okay? There are two types of baseball pitchers. There are the healthy guys trying to get better or stay healthy, and then there are the guys who were hurt trying to make it back. So some of the answers for what you should be doing are different for sure for the rehab setting or the healthy guy. But just on the healthy guy, let's say, or a team of healthy pitchers, I think you could succeed, or in your center, Brent, I think you could succeed with weighted balls. You can succeed with long toss, but you could also succeed without them. So there's science and there's art. And the science is I've measured and what happens when you do these different throws. And the art is trying to put together a program, either individualized or for a team, that works. Now, that being said, you just put up the point that throwing a 4-ounce baseball or 7-ounce baseball is not the exact same thing as throwing a 5-ounce baseball, or flat ground throws are not the exact same thing as pitching. I do want to say on record, the best exercise for full effort pitching is full effort pitching.
Right.
However, I do also want to say on record that you can't do that all day.
Right.
And that's a big problem and why there's so many injuries today, is that the amount of full effort pitching during competition is too much for the body to handle. So here you have a pitcher, you want to be as good as you can, and I'm saying that the best exercise for pitching is pitching. It's the exact same thing, but you can't put the demands on your body, your muscles, your ligaments, your tendons to keep doing the same thing in the same motion at the same velocity again and again, and that's how you get overuse injury. So I think the value of weighted balls and long toss and flat ground throws are twofold. One of them is essentially to give your muscles and ligaments, tendons a little break. They're strengthening, but they're in a slightly different position. I think there's a anatomical, physiological advantage to that. The other advantage of doing something besides pitching is, from an athletic point of view, a proprioception point of view, you want the athlete to understand his body as much as possible, as well as possible. And so you have all sorts of drills, whether it's the balance of standing on one leg or trying to throw a heavier ball or lighter ball into a strike zone. Your body has to learn and adapt, and I think there's a real value to doing drills that are like pitching, but not exactly pitching. And honestly, I know, Brent, you're an expert, and a full training program has a lot of concepts such as periodization. You should have different things in season and off season, and also a variation where you're putting different loads on your body, doing different things, and working different parts of your body. So those are some of the concepts, and I think weighted balls and long toss, they can be used in a program like that, and they could also not be used. So I don't think there's one magic ticket, but I think overdoing anything and seeing a velocity go up and seeing your shoulder rotation go up, I think that's artificial if you do it too much. And just like if you were to throw 100 full effort pitches every day, 7 days a week, that would be too much of doing one thing. And there has to be some common sense from the strength specialist.
No, I'm very much agree with all that, and I believe there's core principles in all of this. I believe there's core principles in the kinetic chain that we need to follow. I believe hip to shoulder separation helps us reduce a lot of stress to the arm and gives us time to apply more energy from the lower extremities. I believe getting a more linear trunk to the target helps drive more kinetic energy to the ball and doesn't prevent you from dragging your arms or having to overuse your arm. I believe in any modality used in training, throwing or loading the throw, it needs to be done in a range of stress. I think y'all have done enough studies to show, for example, long toss, when you exceed 120 feet, you're at the same amount of torques on your arm as you are at 60 feet on the mound. And then if we look at weighted balls, I do have some questions there, but torques do go down with the heavier weight. But is that a difference in torques, more torques over time as opposed to peak torques? But the point is, I believe there's the core principle in any training modality for throwing should be there's a range. There's a range of stress we have to stay in. Also, too, in longevity, like you guys have proven that you throw more than 8 months out of the year, you're 5 times more likely to have injury. So it's saying, yeah, throw, but don't throw more than 8 months out of the year. Don't you think there's core principles here that would really keep a lot of kids safe in their training by following this from the kinetic chain all the way into their training volume?
I think you said it exactly well. Yeah, I completely agree with you that there's modalities, and you want to have a training and throwing program, and has to all be well thought out. And you have to be very cautious about any exercise that's actually more stressful than regular pitching. And again, some of the flat ground run and gun type weighted ball things might be more stressful. So you have to be very cautious about, it's enough stress during pitching. So looking at a whole program and putting the different parts together, you want enough where you're building up strength and maintaining strength, but you don't want you don't want to overdo it. I mean, it doesn't make any sense.
Perfect. So I think we've defined that really well. Thank you. Let's talk about how is baseball getting this information? Because I think just in these almost an hour of time we've sat here, you've put out just some critical information that every parent and player should be studying. Do you think this information is getting out to the community of baseball?
Actually, I'm very excited about where we're at right now. 30 years ago, I was just some oddball nerd doing this, me, Dr. Andrews and I, and then, then it started to get a lot of play and understanding real quickly by doctors and physicians, physical therapists, other medical professionals. But it was slow to be embraced by coaches and by teams. But I'm really excited where we're at right now. First of all, there's professional baseball and there's amateur baseball. And I do think in both cases, today's instructor and coach has a lot more information and education on what proper mechanics are, instead of this is how I did it. I mean, just our technology and publications from places like ASMI, there's a lot more information out there. Interestingly, in Major League Baseball and professional baseball, I'm very excited that there's a new embracing of biomechanics in baseball. I think it started with Moneyball and Billy Bean and all that stuff where science started to come into baseball. That was more about batting averages and on-base percentages and mathematical, not physical. But then the TrackMan, StatCast, all this stuff where they're actually tracking where the balls move nowadays. All of a sudden, people running the pro teams were getting more numbers than they knew what to do with, and so there's a new type of people working with baseball teams, analytics, who are looking at statistics, but also looking at some on-field measurements. And I am happy to say that more and more teams are now using biomechanics for analyzing full pitching mechanics. We're still in a situation where a lot of teams, organizations send their major or minor league players to me, to ASMI, and we're happy to help them and analyze them. But I'm really happy to see that teams are in-house starting to have their own team of people trying to understand that. So it's very exciting. In amateur baseball, sometimes amateur baseball has to follow professional baseball due to the dollars. They have more access, obviously, the pros. But amateur baseball, there's technology is trickling down, and some of it's out there. For instance, there's this thing called the Modus elbow sleeve, which I was involved when they helped develop that. And that's a company in New York where you have this sleeve, and it measures some biomechanics of your elbow when you throw. I mean, I think, and then you can see how much force you're putting on your elbow and other measurements. And I think some of this is trickling down. So, Brent, we're not there, but I'm really excited about how science is becoming accessible to baseball, and baseball's trying to figure it out.
Well, I think you were saying it with the movement or how sabermetrics has changed the game. I've said it. Biometrics is going to be the next revolution. I'm hoping it's happening. So would you say that you think that's what's happening now? We're going to have.
I've said that also.
Yeah.
I said this is essentially the new Moneyball to me. The first one again was how statistics is more important than other things. There's some value there, and then I think the next thing is measurements about your human body, measurements of your on-field motions. I think people are realizing this is the next front. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, because I can see it where and I've always said if they could do something like a combine, not to say they have to, but if they did something with the combine to where they're measuring all the biometrics of these athletes, prospects or current players, then they can run a database and correlate them to other great players. So if they have a young prospect, they could say he has the same biomechanics of this great MLB player who had 20 years in the league or something, and then they could also use it for injury. Like you should never put a pitcher back on the field if his biomechanics aren't the same as they were before, or ultimately better. Don't you think that once they start doing this, all of a sudden their injury rates are going to go down?
I think so. I mean, I hope so. That's what I'm working on, and it's getting there. Teams are using it, and ultimately, I do see biomechanics making it onto the field during competition, just like that. Pitch tracking is happening during games. I do see the future, because I'm aware of some of the technologies that are trying to get to the point where you could be measuring and say, his stride length has shortened, or he's dropping his elbow. This is things pitching coaches are looking for right now, but I do see a time in the future when there'll be such as that data. I mean, the first thing that came about, decades ago, is that teams were able to see when their pitchers had less accuracy, less control, and they were walking people, and they were able to look up on the scoreboard and see that his velocity is going down, his pitch velocity. I do anticipate that they'll have more data besides pitch velocity. They'll have access in the dugout to other things such as his biomechanical changes.
I mean, they should be able to predict injury one day. Would you say yes or no?
I think so. I think we've shown that. I think it's here now. We've shown plenty of studies that you have these types of mechanics, you have this type of risk of injury, you have these types of mechanics, you have this type of risk of injury. I do want to point out that your mechanics are one aspect of your risk of injury. Right. Another big aspect is how much you pitch and how much you rest.
Right.
Other Other aspects are your strength conditioning and your nutrition as well. But all other things being equal, we've shown that pitchers with certain mechanics have more injuries than pitchers with other types of mechanics.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. I think we're slightly behind when it comes to like player development than something like football. Like football's now doing these recovery rooms, and like I read this article with the Redskins and how they have like these floating chambers and these beds where they go in and sleep. And so I mean I think it's just seeing what football's doing, it just shows how there's so much more baseball could do to really keep these athletes healthy, that I'm like you said, I hope they're catching up, but I think that there's so much more they could apply, don't you think?
There is, and some of that is happening, whether it's sleep or nutrition. There are people in professional baseball working on all competitive advantages and health things. So it's there.
All right.
It's behind the scenes right now.
Last real quick one, because I know people are excited about this, because I have my opinion on it, obviously. You're saying we've capped out on velocity. Is that true?
I've capped out on my velocity. but yeah. I've said this before. I've said this decades ago, actually, and I'm actually kind of proud of that I was right in my prediction. But 20 years ago, people were asking me, we had someone pitching 100 miles per hour 20 years ago, and another guy, is it going to go up to 110, 120? And I said, no, based on all these things we've spoken about today, you can make your mechanics better, and maybe you could train your muscles to be better, but the weak link is the ligaments and the tendons holding the joints, the elbow and shoulder together in particular. And right now, the elbow and shoulder ligament and tendons are at their maximum right now, pitching 100-ish miles per hour, even with proper conditioning and proper training and proper body size. So I don't see how an elbow and shoulder could take more velocity. You can't beef up your ligament, your elbow and shoulder. I do see, as I said for years, I see more people kind of figuring it out and getting to this maximum, and that's exactly what we're seeing. That today's best velocity and 10 years ago and 20 years ago are not that different, but the average velocity continues to rise because more guys it's getting more crowded near the top.
And makes perfect sense. But here's my theory of how it goes up. Tell me if I'm wrong. The athletes get bigger. So what if we get a 7-footer who moves like, 100, like Chapman, and yeah. Wouldn't that do it? So because he has bigger joints, bigger ligaments, wouldn't that do it?
Again, if it's just mechanics, it could do it. But if it is biomechanics, it cannot do it because the elbow ligaments and tendons of the 7-footer compared to the 6-footer, we don't have any data to say their ligaments are proportionally bigger and stronger.
But if more Aaron Judges show up, that it won't change the game?
I think you could hit the ball farther. I think you could run faster, but base runners and batters are not filling up the surgery room right now. Okay, and so the body is not at its functional limit for those other things, but it is at its functional limit for throwing, as we can see by the number of people on the injured list, and even at the high school is getting injured. So unfortunately, or fortunately, I think we will not get higher velocity because this is all the ligaments of the elbow and shoulder can take. I don't know any way around that.
No, I would definitely agree. I was just wondering if there's a prodigy that could break that mold.
There always could be one guy.
Yeah.
I mean, how did Nolan Ryan pitch
exactly
100 miles per hour for 25 years in the 1980s? I mean, but we, in science we study the population, not
exactly, not the outlier.
Yeah. I do want to say as we wrap up that we have a lot of this information that you've been referring to, our publications and proper biomechanics, on our ASMI website, asmi.org, including, we analyze a lot of pro players, but also your listeners, whether they're an instructor or a dad or mom, we analyze one-on-one the same way we analyze high school and college pitchers. And then even you, Brent, if you send someone to our lab, the results are not worth anything unless someone does something with it. So the most successful use of biomechanics is if you have a private instructor or a team instructor who knows what to do with these results. Sometimes you analyze a pitcher at ASMI or elsewhere, and we say you need to change your arm path, and that's good, and mom and dad smile, but if they don't know how to do it, they need someone to do it with them. Or sometimes we say, your problem is you don't have enough trunk flexibility or leg strength or something, and so in that case is the thing to do is to work with a fitness strength coach, someone to work on the physical attributes versus the technique. So anyway, I just want to say all this stuff we're talking about how we analyze pro pitchers, this is also being done trying to help individuals.
No, I love it. I've worked with a lot of y'all's analytics. I've had many parents, players come down and show me all of your data, and it's extremely helpful, and I actually love to work with it. It's a lot of fun. So
I love hearing those stories. I love that.
Yeah, so I'm going to say it right now, anyone out there that would like to go to ASMI and be put through all their advanced technology and analyzed, I would highly, highly recommend it. What are other things that you could send them to? I know, y'all do a lot with PitchSmart, right?
Yes, thank you. You just asked and answered my question. I was about to say, if you could go to one website on the internet, I would go to pitchsmart.org. This is a website that was set up by Major League Baseball in conjunction with USA Baseball, based on a lot of the leading research and science and medicine, and it is the most important website I know of for trying to help people succeed in baseball, especially pitchers, and stay healthy. It has information about scientifically proven pitch count limits, and also things such as what is a Tommy John surgery and things like that. So pitchsmart.org.
And if we have any young aspiring biomechanics or biomechanists, where would you send them to start their education?
Yeah, so interestingly, about a month ago was National Biomechanics Day.
Awesome.
And it's a thing the American Society of Biomechanics started about 5 years ago, because for this very reason. I told you a story about an hour ago about how I started finding the career of biomechanics or defining it. It didn't really exist. But now people still don't know enough about it, whether it's students or adults. So I would look up National Biomechanics Day. And there's some videos from us and others who have, there's actually one on our ASMI website, but National Biomechanics Day, it shows what biomechanics is, whether it's in baseball or elsewhere, and it kind of, in high school these days, there's some sports medicine classes, and we're just trying to make high school students more aware of biomechanics as a possible career in college.
Exciting. Oh, well, this was a real honor, Doctor. I'm so grateful that we got to do this. Thank you for all this time and wonderful information. And any last words?
No, I really enjoyed this, Brent. Yeah, it was a good conversation. I enjoyed, you know what you're talking about, and I think that's the whole trick. We have scientists like me, but it's really not worth much if you don't have people like you who are applying it. And that's. I don't want science to go on a bookshelf. I want it to help your listeners, whether it's a pitching coach or a pitcher. So yeah, it's a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm going to end it right now, so hold on the line.